Welcome to the Insight Stream, Science Meets Philosophy, a podcast where we explore the intersection of reason and revelation, bringing timeless wisdom into dialogue with contemporary thought. My name is Kenneth Valpey. I'm a research fellow of the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies in Oxford, United Kingdom, where I co-direct the Bhagavata Purana research project alongside today's guest, and I'm honored to serve as your host for this series brought to you by the Bhaktivedanta Institute based in Gainesville, Florida. This is episode 6, and the title is Philosophy and Hermeneutics, Interpreting Sacred Texts. And today I'm pleased to welcome Professor Ravi M. Gupta. Professor Gupta is the Charles Redd Professor of Religious Studies and Department Head of History at Utah State University. He's the author or editor of 5 books, including an abridged translation of the Bhagavata Purana, which we co-authored and published with Columbia University Press in 2016. He has received 4 teaching awards, a National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Fellowship, 3 research fellowships, and a book award. He also serves as a research fellow of the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies and is a past president of the Society for Hindu-Christian Studies. In today's conversation, we'll explore hermeneutics, the art and science of interpreting sacred texts, and we'll examine how classical interpretative methods continue to offer insights into contemporary questions. So, Dr. Gupta, or if I may, Ravi, welcome and thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Kenneth, for the very kind introduction. I believe we have met before on an occasion or two.
I believe so also.
Our time together, yes, our time together goes back many years now, I think a quarter century, all the way back to our graduate school days in Oxford.
Yeah, when you were 17 years old and I was 45 years old.
And it's been ongoing collaboration since then, and in both teaching and research with the 2 Bhagavata Purana books that you mentioned. So I'm happy to be here today with you discussing this rather expansive topic of hermeneutics.
Yes, which I suspect we're only going to be able to scratch the surface of, but that we'll do some serious scratching.
Yes.
Maybe we can start by, let me ask if you think our definition of hermeneutics that I just mentioned is adequate. Hermeneutics, the art and science of interpreting sacred texts. Is that enough for us to understand what is hermeneutics?
Yeah, I think so. I just add that interpretation includes both theory, or hermeneutics includes both theory and method. So it's about, why to do it, what principles guide our interpretation, but also the specific methods of doing so. And that's what makes it very useful, very expansive in nature. It's also unavoidable, I think. We all interpret as we read and as we study any text, whether we are conscious of it or not. And hermeneutics basically attempts to make make it conscious, to develop theoretically, intellectually, what we might already be doing implicitly, even when we deny that we are interpreting anything. We tend to be interpreting.
Yes. I was thinking about this in a broader, maybe broader context of semiotics, the reading, the interpretation of signs. And the simplest example might be the stop sign. You're driving a car and you come to an intersection and there's a stop sign and it's spelled out in a language, stop, but it's also a certain shape and a certain
Mm.
color and so on. And I suppose one could misinterpret that. Maybe someone doesn't know the language. I don't know. Various reasons one might think that it means the opposite. It means go as fast as you can or something. But we interpret, we see this, it's just a piece of metal that's colored a certain way, and we interpret it. And I think what's significant here is based on our interpretation, we act a certain way. We stop
Mm.
the car. Uh,
Right.
so that might how might we apply that point in our discussion of interpretation of scripture? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I actually want to I there's something similar. That stop sign example I think is really useful, and it also reminds me about another related point here, which is that interpretation of texts is not only of the written word. I think we assume, at least for the sake of this discussion, that that's primarily what we're speaking of. But text can come in many forms, including spoken words and also images,
Mm,
icons, images that all require hermeneutical understanding in order to unpack what is present there. So one of the things I like to do in one of the courses that I teach here at Utah State University is to impress upon my students the importance of learning how to interpret an image, that an image is not self-evident. If we say a picture is worth 1,000 words, we don't know what those 1,000 words are without a lot of education and interpretation and background knowledge.
mm,
Um, so I start by putting on the screen this classic scene, just a still shot of it from the children's movie called The Lion King, which
mm,
all my students have watched, of course, growing up. And it's the final scene where well, I don't know. It shows up at the beginning and at the end. So it's kind of this sandwich scene of the Lion King holding up the prince over Pride Rock, and kind of holding him up high to present him the next king, the prince, to all the animals of the kingdom. And he's holding this little. It's actually not him, the Lion King. Mufasa, the monkey, is holding this baby lion cub up high. And they know exactly which point this shows up in the movie and what it means. But I proceed to intentionally offer a simplistic, incorrect interpretation of that image. I say this monkey is clearly has ill intention and is planning to throw the child off the rock into the ravenous herds of animals down below in order to
oh,
kill the future prince, and so on. And they find this humorous and interesting. And I say, look, if I hadn't seen the movie, if I didn't know something about popular culture, then I would be very prone to misinterpreting this image. And then I show them an image of Narasimha, the man-lion avatar of Vishnu, who is tearing into
mm,
Hiranyakashipu, who's lying in his lap. And I say, now interpret this image for me. And at this point, the students are, of course, going in all different directions in terms of trying to make sense of this image. Some think
Yes.
it's a demon, others think it's a god, some others think that it has nothing to do with demons or gods, that this is
Mhm.
a scene of an animal and a human. And I think this really instills the point in them that interpretation is hermeneutics is not an option. It's essential because we really don't know what to make sense, how to make sense of anything, unless we have the appropriate tools to do so. And that's what hermeneutics provides, is basically a toolkit for us to make sense of whatever text we are reading, whether that's a visual, oral, or written text.
Now, to be slightly a miniature devil's advocate, someone might say, well, that's all right, but I think what you're concerned about more specifically is what are broadly called Vedic texts. And we don't find any, I mean, this word hermeneutics, where does this come from? This is, as they say, Greek to me. Yes, it's a Greek word. Uh, so they may say, well, there's no Sanskrit equivalent to whatever you're saying this is. What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, of course, concepts from different cultures don't map cleanly onto a new culture, new environment. So if we were to look for, a thing called hermeneutics, that maps exactly on a thing called whatever in the Vedic tradition, I think that would be rather unreasonable. It's an act of translation. And translation always means that there's some parts that overlap and some parts that don't, which is why translation is a scholarly activity and not merely something that Google can perform. Because despite its claims to the contrary, you actually need to put it's an interpretive act, translation.
Yeah.
It requires a hermeneutics of its own. But anyway, to your point, hermeneutics doesn't map exactly on a term because it's not an Indian term. Nevertheless, there's a very, very long, robust, erudite tradition of interpretation that is parallel to hermeneutics in the biblical tradition that occurs in India, in Vedic India and medieval India. In its most ancient form, we might call this mimamsa, which an attempt to, which has always been an attempt to think or reason through sacred texts and to ask ourselves, how do we understand these texts? And to your earlier point, how do we understand them for the sake of informing action, right?
Mm.
So if I can emphasize one thing, is that hermeneutics in India, it has such a long and robust tradition, but it's never been done only for the sake of intellectual thought. There's
Mhm.
always an application. That stop sign is always meant to get you to act in a certain way. And
Yeah.
this is true from the earliest times to the present day.
Yes. So you've brought up Mimamsa, and this points to the term that I mentioned, Vedic. This, of course, is also a matter of interpretation, isn't it? What constitutes Vedic literature? And this points, I think, to issues of authority. What is the what constitutes the authority of a given text? So I know I'm just sort of throwing out a big subject here, but if you want to grab one corner of that and say something about, but I think the question of authority is important if we're talking about hermeneutics. The stop sign is there if we're going to keep to that image based on some state authority, we can say. and so on. So if you have some thoughts on this.
Yes, certainly. And I think that's an excellent place to start. For both, for the various um, traditions of Indian philosophy that are regarded as orthodox or Vedic in a general sense of the term, this notion of authority is crucial. And it often is described as shabda, which means knowledge from a reliable source or verbal testimony, or in a theological context is often translated as revelation. But in a broad sense, it can mean knowledge that comes from reliable texts, such as the Vedas, that are regarded as having no human origin, or it can come from human authors who are regarded as reliable in some way, or as Nyaya would describe it as apta,
Hmm.
of having uh, um, the necessary qualification or authority in order to speak reliably on a particular topic. In Vedanta, this is often described as adhikara, or the one who has the ability, the privilege to speak about a topic because they are qualified to do so. And their words often either form they are either regarded as shabda or they help to explain or interpret shabda. So
Hmm.
that idea of shabda, along with the person who has the adhikara, the ability to properly interpret shabda, these two, I think, are crucial to the various Indian traditions that rely on authoritative texts.
Now, this reminds me of some course I took as an undergraduate, religious studies. Hmm, maybe it was in Barbara Holdridge's class. Any case, the topic of what constitutes canonical sacred text. And a point I always remember from that is a canon is always a canon for a community. So there are those who identify with a certain community and therefore, well, it can go in two directions, I guess, because someone considers a text canonical, that makes them a member of the community. But it can also be that a community decides that a text is canonical. Um, and to me, this raises questions because this is, I think, the more difficult area of what we're concerned with if we're talking about interpretation of sacred text and how it might be of interest to modern science, for example, then it's very easy to dismiss a Vedic text because, well, I'm not a member of that community. So uh, someone may be an authority in interpreting the text within that community. Um, that's great. I wish them all the best, but that's not where I belong.
Mm. Yeah, the point about community, I think, is crucial here because the 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 appropriate person to interpret a text is appropriate that person who has adhikara or that
Mm,
person who has the right or the capacity to interpret shabda, whose testimony is reliable. That person is reliable not only because of their intellectual prowess or their personal devotion or indeed their character, but
mm,
because they are properly situated in relation to a community.
mm,
And this is, again, one of those broad, universal principles of hermeneutics in the broadly speaking Vedic traditions, is that the location of the interpreter in community and their ability to carry the interpretive tradition of the past, described as parampara or sampradaya, while also offering insight that is relevant to the community that they speak to now. That's one of those classic tensions of hermeneutics, and we might say even a hermeneutical circle, in that one informs the other, right? So we're used to vicious circles in common parlance.
Yes.
And these are a vicious circle is one where each element essentially takes away from the other and forces you into this spiraling loop that spirals downward to no resolution. And a hermeneutical circle, in contrast, is a virtuous circle. It's
Ah,
each piece of that circle is strengthening the others. Each time you go around the circle, you're not going down a spiral, you're going up a spiral. Your understanding of that text is increasing as a result. And the interpreter's location within both tradition and present day community is one of those circles where you're trying to retrieve from the past and you're also trying to contribute, dare I say, innovate for the present, right? And you're trying to make it relevant to the present. So these two things, then in a virtuous circle, in a hermeneutical circle, they're strengthening one another. Each time you try to speak to present concerns, you learn something about the tradition that you did not recognize before. Oh, there is space here. There's opportunity here. There's new ways of thinking about it that are enshrined in tradition, but perhaps I failed to recognize or I ignored or I didn't see it. And each
hmm.
time you look at tradition, it further informs and strengthens the ways in which you can apply it to the present community. So location and community, both past and present, I think this is a crucial point of interpretation of hermeneutics that you bring up.
Maybe we can say that there's no there's no question of being in some kind of neutral position, sort of outside of the circle. And perhaps this is where the modern academy stumbles when it approaches sacred literature, is it's trying to interpret from outside of that circle, and it doesn't work because there's no, as was once said about Chicago, I believe, there's no there there.
Yes, I think this is a good point, and it's the idea of a purely objective viewpoint from which you the God perspective, if you will, from which you stand and you see everything as it is without any subjective coloring to that, I think is or has been, at least in the past, one of the challenges in terms of academic study, particularly in religious studies, but in other areas also. At the same time, it's also, or scientific study, it's also been a similar challenge in terms of religious fundamentalist interpretations of texts, is a claim to an interpretation that's a reading that is not an interpretation, right? This
Mhm.
is not interpreting anything because this is exactly this is a viewpoint that is plainly the meaning of the text, regardless of how you look at it.
Yeah,
And it's kind of a
for
hallmark of
all
fundamentalists. Yeah.
for
So
all time.
yes, for all time. And if you think about what you said and what I just said, it makes for very strange bedfellows, right? Scientific thinking that assumes a purely objective perspective, and fundamentalist religious viewpoint that assumes a purely objective perspective,
Strange.
make for very
That is
strange bedfellows.
strange bedfellows indeed. But you mentioned the word innovation, and so the interpreter who is in the community and properly situated is has this capacity to apply tradition to present contexts, and that involves, as you said, something like innovation, which means something new. And the fundamentalists may say, wait a minute, there's no such thing as new. It's always as is. There's no change. But there is a tension there, isn't there? I suppose what it amounts to is saying, yes, it's a tension and it's a creative tension.
Yes.
Interpretation is a creative act in some sense. Um, you, maybe we should talk about kind of coming back to basics. What are we doing when interpreting? What sort of assumptions um, are we making about? You've used the word shabda about texts in this tradition, this Vedic tradition. Um, there is this notion of infallibility, and as you said, the Shruti as opposed to Smriti is understood to be not from human origin, although there are scholars of Vedic tradition who would argue from outside the tradition, who would argue that there's so much evidence that these texts have been composed by people. I'm throwing a lot of things there, but what would you say about basic assumptions that are being made? And I guess we want to think about whether there are basic principles of interpretation which are more or less fixed.
Yes. I think that's a good place to to begin. And if we think of if at this point we can agree that interpretation or hermeneutics is essential in no matter how we read a text, we're reading it um, in some interpretive capacity. We're making certain assumptions about whatever image or whatever text we're seeing, then hermeneutics essentially is the attempt to make explicit and be thoughtful about that which is already implicit, or we may be pursuing it without careful thought, right? So going back to the point of innovation, even if we say we will not innovate, we will take exactly what was given to us by the tradition in exactly the way it was given to us, with minimal reinterpretation, changing, application. That would count as a hermeneutical principle that is very useful to make explicit so that both you and your reader know that this is how you're approaching a text. I would rather not begin with a metaphorical or allegorical interpretation of the text or a symbolic one, but I would rather begin with a literalist reading of the text. And that is a hermeneutical principle that it behooves me to articulate, to make explicit. Similarly, we might argue that if my approach to texts is that they are all metaphorical or allegorical, anything discussing those topics which are not accessible by science are necessarily to be interpreted in metaphorical ways, then that is that's a hermeneutical principle that also ought to be made explicit, right? So hermeneutics is essentially then we are looking for those principles that guide our interpretation, and then testing those principles, saying, okay, to what extent does this principle help us illuminate the text? To which case, to what degrees does it provide fidelity to the meaning of the text, or to what degree is it committing violence to the text? And to what degree is it actually useful or beneficial in terms of me applying the text in the world, right? All of those are questions that we use to test the hermeneutical principles that we articulate for ourselves.
That's an interesting notion of an interpretation committing violence to the text. Very interesting. Um, one thought I had was it sometimes, not so infrequently, comes in the news. Some decision, some Supreme Court decision about the U.S. Constitution, and it's interesting to me that there are different schools of thought about constitutional interpretation, right? There are
Yep.
those which I'm thinking of the controversial, is it the Second Amendment about firearms?
Yes.
So, you know, uh, the American public has been sort of wrestling with that over decades and decades, and it's highly polarizing. Um, and here you have, again, getting to the point of texts leading to action. It becomes a question of life and death, in a sense, uh, when it comes to questions like this. And Vedic literature includes uh, a good deal of what's called Dharma Shastra. And there's some pretty wild things in some of the Dharma Shastras, uh, which, if one were to follow literally, would make for a very, very different civilization from what we are familiar with, I think. And that reminds me, I'm just thinking aloud now. You can jump in and make some uh, valuable point from it or not. Some time ago, there was news of someone who, I think they were of Jewish background, and they decided just to see what it would be like to strictly follow all the injunctions of the book of Leviticus in the Hebrew Bible for 1 year. And it was apparently quite some ordeal. So that's maybe also an element of interpretive principles is what do we even take into account from the body of texts that we consider important?
Yeah.
And
It's
that maybe takes us to Jiva Goswami, who, isn't it? He says, well, really, there's one text that's important and all the others don't worry about it, namely the Bhagavata Purana.
Yeah, so I think you've raised a lot of interesting points that have sparked many thoughts here. If I try to collect them a little bit, uh, the if we try to think through what are first of all, I think the Constitution analogy, constitutional interpretation analogy, is very useful because there are those who would argue that the Constitution needs to be understood in the way that its authors, the framers of the Constitution, interpreted. That the original sense of the text is what we need to use to guide our understanding today. And others who would argue that the text is a living document and therefore it should be understood as we read it today for our concerns. So both would recognize, of course, both sides of it, but it's really a question of where you place the emphasis, the accent. And I think that's a great example of kind of what are the underlying principles that guide your hermeneutics. If we think in terms of, well, what are Vaishnav what are some of the foundational principles of Vaishnav hermeneutics, then these are true not just in the Vaishnav tradition, but more broadly, I think, in other Vedantic traditions, then the sense is, okay, we might come up with many such principles that relate to what you were just speaking about. One, I think, foundational principle is that we always begin with the direct meaning, the plain meaning of the text. I hesitate to use the word literal because it carries so much baggage with it, but the word in Sanskrit is mukhya, the primary meaning of the text. We start there, and then we see from there what other possibilities might emerge if we take secondary meanings or indirect meanings or metaphorical meanings, if they do not contradict the primary meaning of the text. So that's kind of one principle that's articulated many, many times in terms of how a general approach to a text. Start with what's primary, get the plain, and this is, I think, quite reasonable. I mean, when I teach text to my students, I say, well, tell me first what the text is saying, then offer your, so let's have a shared understanding of what the basic words mean when they come together in these phrases. Another principle that we might articulate is what we talked about earlier, that no interpretation of a text is appropriate without in some way acknowledging the tradition of interpretation that comes before us, right? That we don't stand in a vacuum. We don't stand alone as interpreters, that there's a whole tradition behind us and a community in front of us that needs to be taken into account. A third might be that interpretation occurs according to desha, kala, and patra, or in a time, place, and audience. That we might, in one word, in English, say that interpretation must take context into account. And the Sanskrit tradition recognizes or describes these contexts often with the words desha, kala, and patra, three important contexts, namely the place, or broadly speaking, the area of study, but also the area within which we live physically, and in which we try to apply the text, the time period within which we are interpreting, and this is crucial to your point about Leviticus, or about Dharma Shastras, right? That even the most literal interpreters in the Vaishnav or the Vedic tradition will make that distinction. They will say, no, we do not need to live in the forest and wear clothing made of bark, because this was appropriate for Satya Yuga, an earlier age, the golden age, not in the dark age we live today. And then your audience, the patra, those who are recipients of the interpretation. What impact is this going to have on them? So these are like, each one of these we could have an hour-long discussion about. But in the space of 3-4 minutes, I've outlined 3 or 4 or 5 hermeneutical principles that would be eminently recognizable to any Vaishnava interpreter, regardless of how liberal or conservative they might be in their interpretation, because these are foundational principles. And how you apply them is, of course, the space for all kinds of debate and controversy within the Vedic hermeneutical tradition.
And that's so interesting, isn't it? That there is so much space that, okay, you have the foundational principles, and yet within that, there's a big space for different interpretations, different conclusions, sometimes radically different conclusions. And this reminds me of something I remember you've said in the past, that that Shastra is endlessly deep, that one can keep going deeper and deeper. This is one of the qualities of, we might want to say this is one of the reasons it's taken as revelation, as something beyond ordinary language.
Yes. And that in itself is another principle of interpretation, is another hermeneutical principle, right? That the text which I study, because some of these principles relate to the nature of the text you're studying. And if
Mm,
I make the assumption that the text I am studying has no end to the meanings that it might offer us, then that means that I approach it in a very different way than if I were to assume going in that a definitive or exhaustive interpretation is possible, right? That,
mm.
I mean, take a phone book. I don't, those things don't exist anymore, but you and I probably we remember, okay, that there's this big yellow book that you
Right.
would go through, or for that matter, a travel guide, like the famous, what is it, Frommer's or different travel guides. Those are texts that one would hope do not have endlessly varied possible meanings. Like I
Right.
approach the travel guide with the assumption that there is a definitive meaning when it says use this tram to get from point A to point B. That there's not, when I get there, there's not going to be multiple trams number 8 that go to various places. That would be terrible, right? So it's not that every text has endless meanings. And yet, this is probably one of the most common interpretive assumptions of sacred text, is that
Mm.
there is no end to how much one can get from those texts.
Which calls to my mind a point which I think is obvious and others don't seem to think so, that much, well, you and I, we worked on the Bhagavata Purana translating, and we saw very clearly this is poetry.
Mm.
And as poetry, it has this depth, this richness, rather than this. It's at least three-dimensional, not two-dimensional. Mm,
Yes, our colleague Rembert Lutyheims, he makes this point often about poetry. He says the the ways in which you understand meaning in poetry, the methods for understanding meaning are different than in prose philosophical
mhm,
works. Uh, and and uh, and he says this on the basis of the interpretive system that emerges out of rasa shastra
mm,
in Sanskrit aesthetics, right? That here we are speaking about Vedantic mostly. We're talking about Vedantic interpretive methods, you and
mm.
I. But if we were to move to Rasa Shastra and ask what are the hermeneutics of interpreting poetry,
Yeah.
it can look quite different.
Mm,
And the focus there is on dhwani, or the power of suggestion, where the
mm.
primary meaning is the one that is embedded in the sorts of echoes that one hears in the text, that the poet has wants you to hear without actually saying it
Yes.
explicitly.
Famously, Gangayam Gosha.
Yes.
Maybe you can explain that little famous example of what you're saying.
Yeah, this is one of the classic examples. Gangayam Ghosha means in Sanskrit the village on the Ganges, Newcastle upon Tyne, London on Thames, like that. And the direct meaning in this particular case, the primary meaning, is challenging, because to imagine a village on the Ganges, Ganga Pravahe, on the actual flow of the Ganges, is difficult unless one were thinking of some sort of supernatural situation. Human settlements typically don't occur in rivers. And so then one must move to the secondary meaning, which is Gangayam Tire, that this is on the banks of the Ganges. That idea of the bank must be supplied, even though it is not directly mentioned.
Mm.
I'll just pause here before moving on to the third meaning to say this is one of, I think, speaking about space, right? Creating space. This is one of these areas that creates space for scientific study of sacred texts is to note the fact that the move from the primary to the secondary meaning is usually prompted by the fact that the primary meaning is implausible. And often it's implausible because it doesn't match with with empirical observation. And so Jiva Goswami gives another example of this. He says, the stones float, or the earth speaks. These are statements found in Vedic texts of like classical Vedic, the Brahmanas. And he says, well, it's given the fact that it's unreasonable in ordinary circumstances to think of the earth as in the mud speaking, or the stones floating. These are the stones speak. The text says the stones speak because by praising the stones in this way, it increases the efficacy of the stones that are used in the process of pressing the soma juice from the soma plant. Or when the waters speak, it is referring to the devas, to the gods who preside over the waters, who are speaking, rather than water actually coming out and talking to us. So
Yeah.
he's offering a secondary interpretation because the primary one is not available to empirical observation, or it's not compatible with empirical observation.
While we're on that topic, I'm a terrible interviewer, jumping around as I am. But while we're on that topic, you mentioned Jiva Goswami, and I know you talk about chinks in the armor uh, of
Shabda.
Shabda Pramana. There are others that Jiva Goswami talks about, and you suggest that these offer a kind of, I think you use the expression wiggle room for, yeah, for bringing in present circumstances or maybe scientific discovery or perceptions or just everyday perceptions. Maybe you can say what else Jiva Goswami said about this.
Yes. First of all, let me say that there's no question that Jiva Goswami, like other Vedantists, regards as the primary, the best form of, the most reliable form of knowledge, or means to achieve knowledge. This is pramana, a valid means of achieving, a means of achieving valid knowledge, right? How do we know what we know, and how can we be sure that it is accurate knowledge? That epistemological question is enshrined in this term pramana. And there are different means of knowing. We can know through our empirical observation. We can know through reason and inference. We can also know through reliance on reliable sources. And the Vedantic tradition in general, but also more broadly, the Vedic tradition in general, asserts that the most reliable form of knowing is knowing from sources that are reliable, right? So this is called Shabda Pramana. And the paradigmatic example of this are the Vedas themselves, the sacred texts, revelation. So Jiva considers Shabda to be preeminent as the most reliable form of achieving knowledge is through verbal testimony or through revelation. And occasionally, he and other Vedantists say things that make it sound like there therefore is no space for empirical observation, because such empirical observations are they're prone to error, of misapprehension, misperception. Their knowledge is very limited to only things we can perceive by our senses, and therefore they do not provide knowledge about more transcendent and more consequential subjects. So there can be a lot of embedded criticism to other means of knowing, particularly pratyaksha, or empirical observation. And yet, when we read Jiva Goswami, we find that he is not at all interested in, as we say, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? Yes, there are problems with empirical observation. I think any reasonable person would recognize that there are issues there. And yet we need empirical observation and inference, if nothing else, at least just to understand sacred texts. There's no way to understand sacred texts without using your senses and using your reasoning capacities, right?
Right.
So my general argument has been in the paper that I have presented and now is in the process of publishing, is that we need to work towards a more dialogical model of the Brahmanas. That is a model where the different means of knowing are in conversation with each other, they support one another, and crucially, they test one another. And my argument is that this is embedded within tradition, although not regularly emphasized, right? That all three need to test one another. So if we think of the fallibility of our sense perception, we think, well, I look at the sun and I see that it's the size of a quarter. The fact is that by use of inference, or another pramana, anumana, by use of inference, I can correct that misperception or that partial perception by recognizing that things at a distance are much smaller, even though they could be larger when I go there. And similarly, our perceptions are corrected by scripture, which tells us about things that are not available to our immediate perception, like the nature of a spiritual reality. At the same time, and this is the crucial point, it works the other way as well. Where Shabda, insofar as it is available to us, is prone to all kinds of error, right? So in an ideal world, all three of these pramanas are perfect and they function perfectly in some sort of like amazing transcendent world. None of our perceptions have a problem. Our reasoning is always perfect. But in this world, even our understanding of scripture or text has potential challenges and issues that come with it. For example, us improperly accepting something as reliable, as Shabda, when it is not, or us misreading Shabda, or the interpretation of Shabda being, the correct understanding being lost over time, right? There's all kinds of ways in which we can go wrong. And I like to give this, my favorite examples of this comes from Bhagavad Gita. Krishna says, over time, this knowledge that I have given you now, I had given thousands of years ago, much earlier, millions of years ago, but now it has been lost over time, right? So Shabda's availability to us decays. But the better example that I like is the one from chapter 11 of the Gita, when Krishna, chapter 10 of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna describes himself in all these amazing ways. I'm of bodies of water, I'm the ocean, I'm the light of the sun and the moon, I'm the taste of water. He says all these things about how he is everything and within everything. And in 11, Arjuna says, okay, you've told me all this about you. I want to see it with my own eyes, right?
Yeah.
And the commentators say that Arjuna, despite being a person of great faith, is asking on our behalf because everyone should test claims to authoritative knowledge. If someone shows up and says, I'm God, my words are Shabda, they're revelation, follow me, we as reasonable human beings should say, show me, right? Like, give me some evidence. And so Arjuna is doing that as a good perceiver on our behalf. In other words, and here's the crucial point, we find that pratyaksha, or empirical observation, is here testing Shabda, right? And so in the dialogical model of the pramanas, we find that each one supports the others. It contributes to a deeper understanding of the knowledge we gain from the other pramanas, but it also questions and tests their veracity.
Yes. Now, of course, the devilish response to the person claiming I am God, and then we say, show me, the response will be, you're not qualified to see. I'm not going to show you because you're not qualified.
Yes.
Um, as we're approaching the end of the time we have, it occurs to me that I've heard this from a scientist that a kind of analogy for the development of scientific knowledge, and we might want to say in this context of the different pramanas of pratyaksha and anumana, that it's like an island within an ocean. The island is the island of knowledge, and the ocean is the ocean of ignorance. And the island is expanded as knowledge is increased, scientific knowledge. However, as it increases, again with this analogy, the uh, the length of the coastline, so to say, increases, which means more and more questions come with every advancement in scientific knowledge. More and more questions come, and I'm wondering. It seems to me we hear something else with regard to spiritual knowledge from Shastra, something kind of the opposite, which is when you get this knowledge, you know everything.
Mm.
And I've always wondered about that. It sounds like it's a kind of closing off, closing the book, but what you've just said suggests to me that no, it's knowing perhaps better to uh, how to engage in this interpretive process involving pratyaksha, anuman, and shabda. So that would be the knowledge that one knows completely, so to say.
Yes. You know everything in that you know the means. You have the means to know everything, right? So in your metaphor of the island and the ocean, essentially you know everything because you've been given a boat to get to that island. And it's up to you to guide it there, right? And this is the point here, like the dialogical model of the pramanas. A devil's advocate could see 100 ways in which it could go wrong, right? 100 ways in which you might use empirical observation to completely undermine, to misinterpret and undermine the authority, the plain meaning of sacred texts. One could also worry on the other side, right? And one could say, one might worry, as many have, that over reliance on sacred texts can completely suffocate our ability to gain knowledge through our senses because we refuse to see what is obvious in front of our eyes, which is tested and proven, right? So we could very easily start a debate or a war for that matter, as hermeneutics has prompted wars in history, right? Between two sides that say what you have just described is too it has too much space for things to go wrong, right? It's
Hmm,
just there's so many ways, so it's just much easier to make things clear, black and white, and simple. And here's how to do it, right? And plenty of people throughout history have shown us how to do it, and then have used armies to enforce the way to do it.
right.
So you have a boat. That's all we know, right? In hermeneutics, we have a boat.
Hmm.
Now that boat, it can get to the island, it can get lost in a storm, it can end up at some other island, it can sink, or it might never leave the shore. There's all kinds of possibilities there, right? And this is what makes hermeneutics an endless task and a very, for people like you and me, a lot of fun too. It's
Mm.
fascinating because of all the ways in which a boat can be used and all the destinations it can lead us to. So all we really know with certainty is that the Vedic tradition, as like the biblical tradition, as like any religious tradition, provides us with a system of hermeneutics that
Mm.
functions as an excellent means of knowing. It provides us an excellent boat on which to cross the shore of ignorance. And let's figure out how to use it.
Let's navigate well.
Yes.
And that's mentioned in the Bhagavata, that the sages are grateful for having a captain who's able to guide them very expertly. He's called Karnadara, and I've always thought that literally could be taken to mean one with ears. Um, and it's actually the ears that give us a sense of direction, isn't it?
Yes, yes.
Which points us back to the point. Shabda means sound, so this is essential to the navigation process. Well,
Yeah.
thank you. I think on this note, indeed, we've hardly scratched the surface, but I think you did a brilliant job of showing essential lines in the direction of where one would want to go in this exploration of interpretation of sacred texts for being relevant for today and for making application and therefore acting on the basis of Shastra in meaningful and beneficial ways. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. As always, the best insights emerge in conversation, and
Mm,
I truly appreciated everything you had to offer by way of content, but also the direction you provided to this podcast. And I hope we have another opportunity soon to engage in conversation. Thank you.
indeed. Thank you.